Hi, I'm Jo Sparrow, President of Jigsaw Queensland and host of Adopt Perspective podcast. Today's guest is Ben Straker. Ben was adopted in 1978 after his 17-year-old mother was sent away from her small country town in Victoria to Carramar Women's Home in New South Wales, where she waited until she gave birth at Hornsby Hospital. Ben grew up knowing that he was adopted, one of two adopted boys in the same household. But for much of his life, adoption felt like a footnote that he wasn't called to explore rather than a defining story. Adoption, though, has a way of bubbling to the surface. For Ben, this changed in 2022 after he became a father and he encountered the concept of the primal wound. What followed was a steep uncovering of the impact of his adoption on his life. Ben's journey includes trauma that didn't initially look like adoption, a mother who declined contact, a father who died before he could be known, and the question that many adopted people quietly carry: what do you do when answers seem like they'll never come? Ben speaks about rejection, ritual, EMDR, fatherhood, the ideology of adoption in religious settings, and how to piece together identity when parts of the puzzle are missing. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ben, how about we go right back to the beginning? What can you tell us about your childhood?
Well, I grew up in Sydney, and it was, on the surface, it probably looked like a pretty normal nuclear family. Two sons, a mum and dad, active in their local church, and just growing up, going to school. And then we moved actually into a regional area when I was about 6. And so that became a really idyllic kind of growing up in some ways. But I think beneath the surface, there was all these things that were unsaid.
Yeah. How would you describe the emotional landscape of your family?
Yeah, it was a really interesting kind of time, I suppose, in growing up, Gen X. So it was kind of like the dynamics of the family were changing a little bit. It always seemed for me that there were always things left unsaid. And I think for a lot of families that was the case, was the way you dealt with conflict a lot of the time was actually just by not dealing with the conflict. It just simmers underneath the surface and kind of disappears eventually when everyone's kind of half forgotten about it. And so for me, I think growing up, there was that navigation of, all right, well, how do I resolve conflict? How do I deal with things? How do I know what this person is feeling about me? How should I be acting towards them when I've got a brother who's also adopted, who deals with it in different ways to me? And I've got parents who I can't understand where they're coming from necessarily, because I just can't pick up the cues. I don't understand. The genetic mirroring means I don't really get what that look necessarily means, or that movement, or that hand on the shoulder. And so it was, I think a lot of my brain was taken up with just trying to work out what I was supposed to be doing in any certain context.
Well, I really feel that. And I'm hearing, I guess, hypervigilance, which is where you're always scanning. I always felt like I had antennas like an octopus or something, or a sea anemone that sort of were out scoping and feeling around it, which was probably trying to keep me safe, because I just didn't understand what the people and what was happening around me. I found that very challenging. I really understand what you were just saying.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as part of that, I was hyper aware of other people's potential embarrassment. And I would just always, that was like, for me, I could see it coming, and it was just the most excruciating kind of feeling inside me when I could see that something like that was the case. But I was also really good at not going there and actually not feeling big feelings. And if there was a big feeling about to come, that got buried as quickly as it possibly could, so I could maintain on the outside a calmness and a composure and a unaffectedness by the things going on around.
When were you told you were adopted, and do you remember who told you?
I don't really actually ever remember a time not knowing I was adopted, but there were some moments that I really do recall, which probably really brought it home to me. Amazing as it is, I can actually remember the day we went and picked up my brother. He's only 2 years younger than me. And so that was incredible that even now I have a really vivid recollection of being in the car and actually seeing the house and actually getting out of the car to go and pick up my brother. So obviously that memory has really imprinted on me. and the significance of that. And so I think we always knew growing up, but the narrative at the time was that it was just a footnote, I suppose, in some ways in my life. And so it was an interesting tidbit, in like when you do the quizzes and what's something interesting about you, it was kind of like the little thing that would be added in there. And so for a lot of my childhood, that was just the way it was. It was just something in the background. But there was one time in particular, my brother was annoyed and he said, I think to my dad, "You're not my real dad." Or maybe it was me. I can't recall actually too, but that was told to me, and it was told to me in a kind of a way of going, that made your dad upset. And that was really interesting because it probably did. But at the same time, it kind of reinforced for me this idea that we don't talk about those things necessarily, and we don't talk about them as if they're not real. So what is a real dad and not a real dad? And so that was really interesting. I think even then I was picking up the cues of, all right, this isn't really something that we're going to share really deeply and openly and have big discussions about. It's a little thing that stays off to the side, but that's kind of where it's going to stay.
You said to me that, or you described, I should say, to me that one of you, as far as you and your brother, was the conformist and one of you was the rebel. Who was who, and how did that play out in your family dynamics?
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting, Nancy Verrier in her book Primal Womb, she talks about this idea that, invariably if there are two adoptees, usually one takes the role of the peacemaker, one takes the role of the rebel. And in our family, that was certainly the case. My brother always, I think, was really dysregulated from an early age. And that was tragic. And when I think back on the fact that he was so dysregulated when my parents picked him up, but they had no understanding because there was no support given to families around how do you actually care for a child that's that dysregulated. He just would cry nonstop all the time. And so I think right from the start for him, and I think also part of that process was that the way he was in care prior to them picking him up really had an impact. So those first formative days and weeks had such a significant impact on him. So him, I think he was always going against things because he just had to. I think it was just an impulse. He knew that it wasn't the reality he wanted to live in. Whereas for me, the way I did the same thing was actually by trying to be totally in control. So I just tried to control every single little facet of my life to the point where I suppose in some ways I'd nearly describe it as being robotic because I didn't want to express emotion. I didn't feel really connected to my body either. And still to this day, that's a really, really big thing I've got to work through is connecting to actually what I'm feeling and thinking and those kind of things, because there's such a disconnect. I've spent so long training myself not to. And so that idea of agency for me was pretty much never there. Always felt like my life was dictated to me right from the start. And so I think for me, it was always trying to work out what role I was supposed to play in the context I was in. And if knowing the rules. Because if I know the rules, I know what I need to do. And the thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to be standing out and I want to survive. And so the easiest way to survive is to follow the rules rather than rebelling. So it was a really interesting dynamic because for me, seeing my brother, I could not understand at all where he was coming from in the same way that he got incredibly frustrated, I think, with me because I was such a rule follower and a goody two-shoes. And so we would clash on that as well, just because of that different dynamic here.
Yeah. Did you ever speak with him about being adopted?
I actually don't know if we ever did. It's really strange to think that, well, we're guys. So, it takes a lot for us to get into deeper things. And we did have opportunities to do that. But I don't really remember too many big conversations around adoption. In fact, hardly any at all. I never recall talking to him about my family and him never talking about his. Sadly, he passed away in 2017. And so my journey, I think, really has been after then and exploring that after that time. But even at that time when those things were going through with him, I could see the impact of trauma in his life and lifelong trauma and the traumatic impact. But funnily enough, did not actually link that with any of my experience. So it was kind of like I was seeing his trauma and seeing what he's going through and really being able to identify it, while at the same time totally oblivious to the impact that it had on my life. And probably because it wasn't as out there. It was probably the socially acceptable way, if you want to call it, of dealing with it, which is keep a low profile. So I think that really, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we never talked about it, because we just never recognized that that was anything to do with what was going on with us.
I actually think that's more the norm than unusual. I've spoken to so many adopted people now, and, I didn't have adopted siblings. I had siblings who were biologically born to my parents, but um, I'm always surprised at how few spoke with their siblings about their experience of adoption, and maybe you're only just starting to now, or question why it wasn't spoken about. And I think it actually breaks my heart a bit.
Yeah, I think so. But I think as well, we didn't have the tools to process any of it. We didn't have the language and we didn't have the understanding. So I don't know where it would have gone. Like, I don't know whether, I'm not saying it would have been a bad thing, but I don't know how productive it would have been. I suppose one of my big things is I don't want to sit in the negative and I want to grieve properly. I want to have that process, but I don't want that to be just my lived experience. I want to step beyond that. And I think that's soul crushing when you just sit in that mire without any tools or feeling you can actually step out of it. So I think things happen for a reason. I think you've got to go through on this life journey, and so sometimes I think you hit midlife and some of those pressures to become the best you can be kind of dissipate a little because you realize that's not going to happen anyway, probably. And so it actually takes the pressure off and you can actually now start to explore the real you rather than having to. So I think, although I mourn some of that, not being able to have that, I also kind of feel like this was the time. It's just a tragedy for him that he didn't get that, I suppose.
Yeah. I had a very big inner life, I guess, refuge life in when I was a child, where I'd be a very deep thinker, but probably no one knew that there was anything ticking at the same time, like, because I
Yep,
didn't share those things, and I read a lot.
absolutely.
That was
Yep.
my refuge. How did you find refuge in your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. Reading for me was just a massive part of what I was doing. I could be a million miles away, and even from a young age, I would just devour any book I could get my hands on. I was doing stupid things. Like, I remember in year 3, I picked up and read Lord of the Rings for some
Wow.
bizarre reason. And so it was just that, and I didn't understand a lot of it, I don't think, but it was just that desire to escape to some other place. And so I think that's why I really got into, at the time, I was really into the fantasy and the science fiction because I didn't want any story that was close to reality. I needed something that was far away from that. So for me, I think reading was such a big part of what I did. I mountain bike. And so for me, getting out into nature, that was something I did. Like, I would freak out if my kids did what I used to do, but I would, like, even at the age of 12, I would disappear off into the bush hours away. And no one knew where I was. And I'd just go out by myself mountain biking on old fire trails and all the rest of it. But it just allowed me to process and think, and I needed that kind of thing, I think, just to try and, I never knew what I was looking for, but I knew there was something that was not there, that wasn't right, that I needed to process, but it took me 40 years to work out what it actually was.
You grew up in a Christian community, and you told me that adoption language is often spiritualized there. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's such a big issue. It's such a big thing. And I know, particularly, when I was born, a lot of the adoption agencies were Christian or religious organizations that actually established them. And so growing up in the community I was in, there was a real idea that adoption, like the Bible talks about adoption, everyone being adopted into God's family. It's seen as a joyful thing. It's seen as actually God rescuing people from their distress. And, this idea of, God rescues the orphans and widows and calls others to rescue the orphans and widows. So all of the things talked about with adoption are all positive. And I have a problem with that because the word adoption for me means so much more than just a positive thing. And I think if you talk to a lot of people, even today in society, they don't actually think about the other side of it. they don't think of the trauma associated with it. They almost seemed, everyone that I used to speak to almost seemed to go to, oh, isn't it great your parents actually adopted you out of this situation? So it's this, they have this positive mindset. Whereas for me, I would usually deflate them a little by saying, yeah, isn't it interesting that it's one of the only traumas that we think is a really positive thing? And so I think in the Christian community, yes, there is a role for actually looking after kids. But gee, wouldn't it be nice if instead of having to take them off couples or off mothers, they actually provided the resources for them to actually keep their kids and to actually, sustain them in that family unit and actually encourage them in bringing up their children rather than thinking the best thing to do is actually remove them and put them with complete strangers. And so I think for me, there's a legacy there that some people in the Christian community, well intentioned in some ways, but got it so wrong. And then there's others that just plain, I think, did horrible, horrible things. And so I think that's something that, as a Christianity has to deal with and it has to work through and it actually has to truth tell. And I know part of the apologies that came out was through some of those organizations. But I think it's really hard, isn't it, when the people who actually did it aren't the ones actually delivering those apologies as well.
Yeah. And I've heard from parents who, the apology means different things to different people. For some people, it means nothing because they've said, just like you said then, it wasn't delivered by the people who actually hurt them. They want to be apologized to by their church, by that pastor, by, their parents, whoever was involved in that decision making.
Absolutely. And I think part of that as well is they just got the gospel message so wrong. Like they just totally misinterpreted what it is. And so that for me over the past couple of years has that been that process of going back and going, right, I grew up in a family that went to church every Sunday. I adapted to that situation by conforming because I had to do that to survive. And I survived by doing that. So I had to go through this process as well of stopping and actually pulling everything apart and going, right, well, why do I think the things I think? Why do I do the things I do? Why do I believe the things I believe? Is it because I believe it or is it because I used it as a coping mechanism to conform to all these things as well? And I think as I did that, what was really interesting was I actually got rid of a lot of the rituals in some ways or the organized part of religion. And I just went back to the source, the text, and actually started reading it for what it was through a lens of actually going, okay, well, what does it say? What does the Bible actually say about adoption? And when I did that, I was fascinated to see the number of characters actually shown in there that are actually adopted and are incredibly dysregulated. Moses is he's a cracker of a character to kind of look at. He's a guy who's, basically born into massive trauma in Egypt. His mum gives him away, well, pretty much puts him in the river, picked up by an Egyptian. So he's actually a cross-cultural adoptee, kills someone at 40. So at 40, he's still dysregulated and yet then comes into his community and is kind of restored. And I love that kind of idea that there is identity that can be found. But for him, it took 40 years to get to that place. So yeah, I find that really fascinating to see.
Yeah. For me, adoption really reared its ugly head when I had my first son. And the same happened for you when your first child was born and your wife and son almost died in that process. What happened for you in that room?
It was really interesting. It was a really traumatic experience. It was, in some ways, big T trauma in that it just kept on replaying over and over in my head. It was like a film that just kept redoing, and I couldn't get rid of it. There was a particular scene in particular that just kept playing. And for me, I was like, okay, I've got to deal with this because I can't not. It's not going away. And I think I grew up, in an age where there was a real stigma to going to see a psychologist. You just didn't do that. That was only for really sick people. And I'm really glad that has kind of eased and disappeared nowadays. And that's a fantastic thing because for me, I always had that, oh, I'm not ever going to be doing that kind of stuff. But it made me actually go and start talking to a psychologist about, okay, this event and why I felt the way I did. As part of that, we did EMDR. But what was really fascinating in thinking about it later was that the reasons why I felt the way I did weren't ever really fully addressed. I didn't realize how close it was to my adoption experience, seeing this taking place. The lack of agency I had, I was just a passenger in the room, and the experience was horrible for my wife. So, I mean, it was far worse for her. But as a bystander who's standing there with absolutely can't do anything and just, yeah, I just shut down. And I think it was like my body knew this, you've been in this place before. You've had this kind of experience before. And so it was really interesting, even through that process of EMDR, it helped me to actually process that thought and actually be able to come out of it and go, you did the best you could. That was kind of the mantra at the end, was you did the best you could, which I did. But we never talked about adoption. We never talked about how that could have actually triggered the response that I had or anything like that. And we talked about all kinds of other things, including I don't like heat and being trapped. Really freaks me out. And the psychologist said, well, I think that, this is really primal. So was it really hot when you were born? That was the question he asked. So I asked my adoptive mum, and she said, oh yeah, it was stinking hot. We had to put you in the bathroom for a couple of weeks with a wet towel over a fan to keep you cool. But that wasn't actually really, I think it was part of it, but that wasn't the reason why I was feeling the way I was feeling. I was so dysregulated at that point in time. So that was really interesting.
It is. And just for our listeners who may not know, EMDR refers to eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a structured psychotherapy approach. It has like bilateral noises or movement. And we do have an episode from a couple of years ago where I talked to a psychologist who practices EMDR. Can't think what it is, but I might put it in the podcast notes. Yeah, it was so interesting to me because when you first told me that story, you said you felt helpless and out of control, which is exactly the feelings I imagine your mother would have been feeling when you were born, and probably what you were feeling as an infant too, when you were separated from her, out of control.
Absolutely.
And sadly, all too often, psychologists don't put together those pieces of adoption, that adoption would have any part of the reactions that we have to things, which is sad that hasn't become part of the education.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
So 2022, stumbled across Gabo Mate, I think I'm saying his name right, which then led you to Nancy Verrier's Primal Wound. How did all that occur?
It was just one of those funny things you do where you're scrolling through your phone on YouTube and one of those little clips pops up. And I had one of those, so I watched his thing on childhood trauma. I'm a teacher, so it does interest me, those kind of things. And this thought popped into my head, which in hindsight is it's obvious, it's so obvious. But this thought popped into my head going, I wonder if adoption is like a childhood trauma. That's how naive I suppose I was in all of this. And so I just then was like, well, I wonder if there's a YouTube clip on adoptive trauma. And I came across a talk by Nancy Verrier. By that time, it was probably 11 p.m. at night, but I just couldn't help it. And I watched the video of her talking, and a lot of what she said just made sense. And so I immediately hopped on and bought the Primal Wound, and that arrived actually the next day. And I think I read it. So that was on the Friday night it arrived. And by Sunday afternoon, I'd finished reading the book. I just absolutely consumed it. And I think it was the first time that I actually read something that made sense to me. It was my lived experience. Just so many things made sense, even down to things like birthdays. The fact I hated my birthday. Every time it led up to my birthday, I couldn't handle it. And so that book really explained a lot of those things that I was feeling. I suppose it validated my feelings that I had for so many years, but couldn't name and couldn't understand what seemed to me very irrational thoughts. They were actually rational and actually made sense.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Nancy Verrier a few years ago too. I'll pop that into the podcast notes as well. And I did have the same feeling the first time I read it. It just, even today, it still stands as an excellent starting point, I think, for adopted people to read and, start their explorations. Everything just starts to make sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
So you said to me that there was like a before and after, like a BC primal wound and an AC after.
Yep.
What did that feel like? Or was it destabilizing? Was it relieving or was it both?
It was everything. I like the phrase I was hearing. So I consumed so many podcasts at the time. I was commuting. And so I just inhaled as much information as I could. And now people were talking about coming out of the fog. And it really felt that way to me. It was like you came out of the fog into sunlight. But when you do that, the cold harsh reality kind of hits. And so what happened then was really a process of me I'm a really methodical, think things through kind of person. And so that kind of kicked in and I was like, all right, I'm going to deal with one aspect of this at a time. Almost like there's a list of things I need to now process, and I'll process one at a time, and I'll start with the first one. And once I've got that one licked, I'll move on to the next one. And so as I was doing that, though, I was kind of like going, there was no roadmap necessarily. It was about, okay, Ben, what's the next thing that's coming to mind? What's the next thing that you need to process or deal with? And I'd then lean into that and then try and see what I could find from there. And then once I'd done that bit, I'd move to the next bit that would always come out of that. And so for me, it was really destabilizing in a lot of ways. There was this sense for me that my identity was not fixed. And it would have been really easy, I think, for me to spiral from that point in time and to lose any form of direction and be really rudderless. But I think I have an amazing family and I have an amazing wife. And so being able to, even in the midst of that, come home with 3 beautiful boys and a loving wife gave me a grounding that I think was really helpful in just that community and being surrounded by people that you know love you, even when you're questioning everything about your past and who you are as a person, was just amazing. And the grace, I think, that came with that, I definitely got obsessive. I think that's part of always our journeys, is that there are things that we just fully hyper-focus, obsess over. And so for me, there were times when that was such a big part of it. Was almost all-consuming and so hard to focus on any other aspect of life because that was the thing that I had to focus on at that point in time. I think the big ones for me was definitely identity, who I am. And I don't think you necessarily fully resolve that, but I think I needed everything to be pulled apart first so I could actually build myself up rather than other people's image of who I should be or who I was. That was really important. But I think for me, that idea of identity was super tied up. It became super tied up in knowing where I was from. That was such an important part of it. And for me, ancestry became my obsession. Getting a DNA test, I don't know. I shudder to think how many hours I've done on ancestry, building a 2,500 to 3,500 size family tree to try and work out who my father was. And so I'd be doing 3 or 4 hours per night, 8 months straight, probably, Nelly, doing that. So huge amount of time, but emotional investment and exhaustion, I think, as well in that as well. And so I think learning that process took me a while to understand when I needed to put things down and go, it's okay. You can actually rest now and approach it tomorrow and go from there.
That's a really hard one. And, guilty as charged. I did a doctorate to try and figure myself out. And I did that like it was a 3-year full-time process. I did in 1.5. And I was working to the point where I was sick by the end, because I hadn't moved enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I get that totally. Yeah.
So yes, any advice from Ben and I today would be
Yes.
Try and get a little bit of balance in your life when you're doing this. And
absolutely.
I know it's hard. So you had actually applied for your original birth certificate years earlier, right? Can you tell us about that? Obviously, you then sat on that until 22 before you started searching. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I actually don't know why I did it in some ways. It was one of those things. It was in 2006. I'd actually just got back from a couple of years overseas and I was actually pretty burnt out. And I think when I was overseas, I was really missing home. I was really homesick. And I was really homesick for my roots, I think, and wanting firm roots. And I think when I got back, it didn't hit the way I was expecting it to hit. And so I think in my head, it was partly like, okay, let's find out where you're actually from. So I applied to the docs at the time, so Department of Community Services, to get my original birth certificate. And that was a whole process because you had to at the time get a supply authority as well. So you actually had to get this signed document from the minister actually giving you permission to actually access your original birth certificate, which struck me as being that was the first time I came across any of that bureaucracy around adoption. And so I thought that was super weird. And I was kind of grateful in some ways in my head that I hadn't tried earlier and had to deal with knockbacks and all the rest of it. But yeah, and then one day it just arrived in the mail. And I drove out to a weir and sat on a bench and opened it up and saw the name of my mother for the first time. And it was a profound moment. In that I found out that actually my name wasn't Ben. My name was actually Christopher. And that was the name on my birth certificate. And yet that was not the name I recognized. And even to this day, I still don't fully recognize it. I have this funny thing, I think something probably to work on, of what's my name and what does it actually mean? And so when I showed it to my adoptive mum in particular, she had no idea. So she was never told that that was my name. They were just, when they handed me to them, the assumption was they got to name me whatever they wanted. So that was a real surprise to me that there was not that. But in some ways I prefer that than knowing they knew I was Chris and yet they decided to change my name anyway. So yeah, it was interesting. But then I didn't have any desire or impulse to look any further. I think if I'm honest, I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to unlock that door. I think there were lots of doors that I didn't want to unlock because I was afraid of the big emotions that might come out. And I think at that point in time, my family was complicated enough. So I didn't really want to add any extra complications to it. So I think it was a self-protective measure, basically, to go, no, we'll just park it. It's an interesting tidbit. Oh, my name was Chris. We'll just leave it there and move on with life.
2022 happened and you stopped sitting on the bench. You got up and started playing. What happened?
Well, I think it was that thing from the book from Nancy made me realize that there was much more to it. And it was something I actually had to face and I couldn't just hide it. And of course I could have. I could have just buried it and just let it go. But I just knew in myself that that was not going to be helpful. And I think it started really interestingly with me reflecting back on my teenage years and really grieving them, which was a really interesting kind of emotion. And I couldn't understand, why am I grieving my teenage years so much, as if they were a missed opportunity for something? But it became really clear to me that it was because something was not right. There was a shadow there that I wasn't dealing with. And it really became clear through the things like the Gabor Mate and the Nancy Verrier that it was the adoption thing. And I was kind of running from it, I think, my whole life. And so I got to that point where I kind of realized, no, if I actually want to enjoy the next 40 years or whatever it is of my life, I actually need to deal with it now rather than wait longer. And I think that whole idea of, okay, well, if I'm going to work out my identity, I actually need to know where I'm from. And so that was also part of it. And so connection with the father figure as well was really interesting. I always really struggled with that. I really always struggled with connection with father figures. I didn't necessarily see them as really positive thing. And it was almost like there was a vacuum there, which now completely makes sense because on my records, there's no mention of a father. So because that's the case, I think subconsciously as well, I knew I needed to investigate and look into that.
Yeah.
So that started the journey.
So what did you find out about your birth and the circumstances around it, and how did you discover this information?
So what I did was I basically applied for my adoption records. And it was really one of those other funny things where I don't know if it was my sense of agency of not asking, but I just had never really considered that maybe there was a record out there and that actually I'd be able to get access to it. It was really funny how that worked through. So I applied for my information. But just before I did that, I had my birth certificate and I was chatting to my wife about maybe it's time to start looking for my birth mother, just to find out some information about her. And so my wife's cousin was actually, she's a lawyer who finds people for wills. So if they've got a will and there's someone named in it, she'll go and find them. And so she's basically investigates and finds people, which was amazing. So my wife had chatted to her and she said, yeah, it's my hobby as well. So send me through the details. Send me everything you've got. So I sent through to her my original birth certificate, plus the information that they give you, My Story, it's called, which is their little storybook that they talk about. And so I sent it through to her, and I had a phone conversation with her at about 2 o'clock on one Saturday afternoon. My wife gets a text at 8 p.m. saying, I've just sent a message, an email to Ben. He might want to open it. And I opened it up, and there's my mum. There's her Facebook profile. There's her address. There's my siblings, her phone number in there. And it blew me away. Like, I was not ready for that. Not so quickly. I was expecting a couple of weeks to process, couple of weeks to work it out. And yet within 6 hours, she had it just done. It was just,
I
yeah, it was
remember
just
that
crazy.
feeling. It's a lot.
It really was. It took a lot to sink in, and it still hasn't fully sunk in, I don't think. It's kind of interesting looking at the photos and trying to get the connection. It's been interesting.
Yeah. So what were you able to first see when you first discovered her and saw her face for the first time? What was that like for you?
It was interesting. There was no epiphany, I don't think. It was it was still a bit of a numbness, I think, and still probably a bit of shock. This person who I've known the name of for 15 years, well, actually longer, because it was on my adoption about information, now has a face. And so I think that was the biggest thing of actually going, this is a real person. It's not my books, the fantasy things that I would escape to. It's not that anymore. It's not like I need to create an image in my mind. It's actually a real person. And my brother, well, half brother, has similar features, similar features, not exactly the same, but some similar features. And that was weird. First time seeing, apart from my kids really first flesh and blood I've actually seen. Well, apart from one, the only blood relatives I've actually had a conversation with. And so, when you're just looking to your kids for that genetic mirroring, it's kind of interesting. So it's great to have that, I think, as well.
So you've got her details now. What happened next?
I sat on it for a little while, but not for heaps long, because I just, at that point in time, I was far enough into the process. I was like, I just need to keep moving now. I think, like, in hindsight, was it good? Probably not. Do I regret it? Absolutely not. It was just, I had to do it the way I had to do it. It was that agency in me that went, no, Ben, you're now going to do it in your time, in your way. You've waited long enough. And so I think there was a real drive for me to have my identity kind of recognized, as it were, to have that validation of going, you exist, you're part of this is where you came from. And so that was really important to me. I think also I had heard lots of stories about the positive and the negative in terms of contact. And so I had a really open mind to things. As adoptees, we always, I think, in the back of our heads are ready for the rejection. That's just our default. Well, it's definitely my default. So for me, it was just like, well, if that happens, well, I thought it was going to happen anyway. So what's the risk here? But I also probably as well thought, I have an amazing family. Who wouldn't want to get to know my kids? Like, they're just amazing. So I thought, well, now's an opportunity to reach out. So I took quite some time, read a whole heap of sample email letters and things like that, and then crafted my own version, I suppose, of that, and then put it in the mail as registered post, which the reason why I did that was so that only she could pick it up. No one else could pick it up. It was also in an Australia Post, envelope. So it didn't look like, it was random and all the rest of it. So I just thought I tried to make it as low key and whatever as possible so that it wouldn't do it. So I sent that letter off, and then there was crickets, basically.
How did your body interpret that silence?
It was interesting. It was there. It was in my body the whole time, and I just didn't recognize it most of the time. But every day I got home, I checked the letterbox, and I didn't used to do that before. But that was my first get out of the car, walk over the letterbox and check. And so that was a really, yeah, that was hard because every day, yeah, nothing. And that went on for a year.
You decided to pursue the search again, but this time with some help. What were your options and what option did you choose?
Yeah, so there was at the time I was talking to the park, the post adoption resource center, but I was also talking to Anglicare because they were the ones who now had my file. So the adoption agency I was with, they changed to Anglicare or they merged with Anglicare. And so I was talking with them and so my caseworker, if you want to call her that, she offered to reach out. And so at that point I thought, I know that had been an option right from the start, but for me, I really felt this desire to do it myself. I had to make first contact. I didn't want to go through someone else to begin with. I suppose in some ways I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, a first opportunity for us to connect without having to have someone else involved, as naive as that possibly is. But I just felt like I had to do that. And a lot of these things, I actually feel like I had to go with my gut. And that I think that's why I have more of a peace about it because I didn't second guess what I was feeling. I just went with it. And that's so unlike me. It's not me, but for this, it definitely was. And so, yeah, so she offered and so I provided her with all the details. And so she sent a letter, didn't receive any reply from the letter as well. We had a phone number. So she tried to use the phone number, but my birth mum's husband answered the phone. So that was awkward. So that didn't work as well. And so kind of as we were talking through, the last kind of option was I told her that I knew who she was on Facebook. And so there'd been this I love Facebook in a lot of ways because it gives you great opportunity to actually see photos, to see family. And so I'd been able to hop on and actually see lots of links and make lots of connections not in terms of friendships, but just in terms of seeing photos, seeing who the relatives and the sisters and that of her were, seeing family photos and those kinds of things. So I knew that she had that, and I hadn't reached out through Facebook Messenger, because I just thought, okay, that's going a bit far, but she did. So my caseworker, she reached out through Messenger and received a reply probably within an hour of doing that.
What was the reply?
Not the reply that I was looking for. It was, it wasn't a good reply, I would say. I remember when I got the phone call from the caseworker, she actually emailed me and said, "Look, Ben, I've received a reply. Can I call to talk through it? Tell me when's a good time to call." That probably gave me a bit of an inkling of, it wasn't going to be exactly what I was looking for, but I just said, yeah, we arranged a time that afternoon. Interestingly enough, I was out at the time. It was not designed that way, but it's just the way it worked out. I was out in the backyard with my probably 1-year-old, if not a little bit younger at the time. We were just standing out in the backyard, and I was kind of holding him in my arms as I took the phone call. And basically, she basically replied and said, "It's not a good time for me to be dealing with this, and I don't know when it's going to be. And I'm sorry, that's not what he wants," which was an interesting phrasing to use as well. And it's not an easy decision, but I don't want it to go badly. So please, no contact. Yeah. Yes.
What was your first emotional response to that?
I was standing there with my 1-year-old in my arms. And I just gripped him tighter, I think. And my first thought was, how could you not want to reach out and hold your child? How could you not want to know this beautiful little boy that's in my arms? And it wasn't anger. Like, there was no anger there at all for me. It was, I think, disbelief, great sadness as well. And probably as I reflected a bit more later, but also at the time going, wow, what happened to you? That this is, and what's happening to you now, that this is your response, because isn't it is a normal response, but it shouldn't be a normal response to an opportunity that, you've probably been waiting for or could be waiting for your entire life. And so I think that, yeah, that's kind of what initially hit me in there.
So, you're out in the yard with your son. What happened next?
Well, yeah, my wife got home and I shared with her what I'd done, and she basically took my son and said, you go do what you need to do. So I hopped in the car, and the car for me is, even in my teenage years, as soon as I got a car, I'd just disappear for hours driving ridiculous number of kilometers. And so I did that. I just got in the car and I drove. It just gives me an opportunity to do something while I'm thinking and processing. I think it's just a really great, I just regulate really easily doing that. But I actually found as I did that, I started driving towards Hornsby Hospital, which is where I was born. And it was just like I had this game plan in my head, which was really funny because before that moment or that day was never really necessarily any game plan I'd ever had. But I just felt like there was this burning desire that I had to go back to the place of my birth and the place where I actually spent the first 5 weeks of my life. So I was in hospital for the first 5 weeks until I was picked up by my adoptive parents. So by that time it was pretty late, and I turned up and it was actually dark, pretty dark, or just on dusk at the hospital. And it was a totally weird and strange thing to do, but hey, I just went with it because why not? And so I just walked into the grounds, and in Hornsby Hospital there's a garden right out the front of the entrance, the doors to enter into it. There's a nice garden there. And I just stood in the garden and I started talking to my mum as a 16-year-old. And I don't know what made me do it, but there was just something that felt right about standing there on the place where so much had happened and talking to her about what she went through and what she was feeling and what I was feeling at the time about what had happened. And there was just something really powerful about doing that. Of standing in a place where something significant had happened and being able to speak out aloud the things that you needed to say, knowing that she's never going to hear it. She's never going to hear that. But the body kind of knew that I needed to do that in order to process, in order to work things through. And it was a really moving experience. And it actually allowed me to move through those emotions, I think, in a really productive way to process them. Not that it doesn't still affect me, and of course it does, and it still has a really significant impact, but I think it allowed me to really process at a really quick stage a lot of the pain that I was feeling. It didn't get trapped. I was able to release that energy, which didn't make me bitter or resentful or those kind of things, which ultimately would just burn me up rather than burning anyone else up. So yeah.
I think ritual is so important. I remember years ago, because I was born at the Royal Brisbane, and I've had to go back, to the Royal a few times for different things, visiting people or people who've had babies, and I hated going there. And even going back for apology events, I just hate it. Uh, and I spoke to a counsellor once about performing a ritual to try and desensitize that place for me. And, I wrote a letter about how I felt about it. And then I burnt it, and I actually took my son and I drove to the hospital and I put those ashes in the toilet and then flushed it there. And it completely changed my relationship with the hospital.
Yeah.
I can go back there now and I don't feel so sensitive about it. I don't feel connected or have that negative energy around it. And I
No
think
way.
ritual is really powerful, and I'm glad you're able to do that spontaneously in that moment. I bet it helped a lot.
Yeah, it really did. And even now, I find when there are things that I want to visit, I carve the adoption symbol, so which is, the triangle with the love heart. And so I carved them in kind of like a Celtic kind of one. And so I have all these little wooden ones that I've created, and it's something that I can leave. So there's one on my brother's grave, I've put one on there. And so it's that thing about where I do visit places that I know are profoundly significant. It's also like the burning, that it's something I can place there as just, I'm leaving that here now. It gets to be in the ground. It gets to decay. and kind of blend back in. It gets to return to dust. And I think it's amazing how the body processes those things.
Yeah. Well, and it's important because as adopted people, we've had a huge grief and loss and no opportunity to grieve it in any public way. You know, it's all about what you gained. There's no ritual, there's no funeral, there's no monument to the loss. And so creating those is really important because it is something that has to be grieved.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So now your search for your father was very different. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, there's no father on the birth certificate. And I knew at the time that, it was putative father. And so that was, a really tricky thing. And so I first was like, right, well, I wonder if there's any adoption records, because when I got anything in the adoption records, so when I got the adoption records, one of the big things was that they said was basically that if I wanted the actual unredacted adoption records, I had to sign, I feel like, my life away.
This is a New South Wales thing. So in Queensland, we don't have that. Yep, carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I had to sign an undertaking that if they provided me with his name, I could not contact him or any of his birth family at all, except through an agency. So they're the only ones allowed to reach out. I'm not allowed to reach out to them at all. And so it's a $2,500 fine. If you do, I don't know if anyone's been charged with it. In some ways, I actually felt like I actually wanted to do it, and I actually wanted to end up in court so I could actually say this is absolutely stupid and ridiculous. But in some ways, I actually didn't see the point because I just didn't know if the records were correct. I have one thing which is really interesting that's actually here. This is actually my adoption records that my mum gave to me. And it actually says on it, Father Wayne. And so I knew supposedly my dad's name was Wayne. And it was something that the adoption agency probably shouldn't have given my adoptive mum, but they'd actually given it for my brother. And she got really mad with him and said, well, if you're going to give it for him, you can't not give it for the other. And so they actually did that. So when I reached out again to the adoption agency, they confirmed that was his name. They said, since you already know, we'll confirm that, but we're not telling you his surname or where he's from. So that was all redacted. So at that point in time, I'm like, how do I find out? How do I work this out? So I actually, at that point, it was a really burning desire. It was kind of like I needed that piece of the puzzle to actually feel like I was real, which sounds strange, but to feel like I was fully real, I needed to know there was actually a father, that there was someone there who actually really lived. So I actually reached out to my mother, and it was probably foolish, but once again, I was in that headspace of going, I just want to know. So I messaged her over through Facebook Messenger. Almost immediately, my mother reached out to the lady my caseworker at the agency, and actually replied to her and said, I'm begging Ben to stop trying to find out things. Can he please stop contacting me or any of my family at all? And when that happened, all of them blocked Facebook. So all of the profiles went private, and my mum actually also fully blocked me, so none of the messages could get through to her at all. That just got me angry at that point in time. I'm like, this is actually not your information to keep for yourself. This is actually important to me, and it's actually my history, and you're actually denying me any opportunity to get that. So that was what I was really feeling at the time. So that's when I probably really doubled down and was like, okay, well, if you're not going to tell me, I'm going to go through the only other avenue I have available to me, and that's through DNA testing. And so that's when my obsession with ancestry kind of began. And I just slammed into it as hard as I possibly could to try and get connections and try and work out who on earth it was that was my father. Yeah, and that took over a year of working through with all kinds of false turns, DNA matches to people who were not the person who it said on the profile it was. So some of the DNA matches were for supposedly aunties when they're actually uncles, and all kinds of things like that. I had a close relative who was a DNA match reach out and say they wanted information, which was exciting. First time to talk to someone who was biological. And then our first conversation, the first thing she said to me was, I'm adopted. And I'm trying to find my father. And so that was exciting, but a huge letdown as well
Yeah.
as that was happening. And she went on to find a father who was on my mother's side of the family through my family tree. Like she used my family tree to work it through, and realized that, yeah, he was excited to know about her, excited to meet her, excited to have connections. He's excited for the rest of the family too. And yet he even went to a funeral where she was from and mentioned me, and just they all shut that down completely, which was really, really kind of interesting as well. That happened. Um, so went through all of those things as well, and then finally narrowed it down through the help of one of the DNA angels, basically, who, goes and helps you with that. And so we found who he was, we think, but unfortunately, yeah, he passed away in 1991. So yeah.
Wow, that's rough.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first time he emailed me, he said to me, "Oh, Ben, I found your father, but I'm sorry, here's his death certificate." So
And the original question that you posed on your prospective guest form to me was really powerful. You said, "What do you do when when the answers will never come?" Ben, what do you do when the answers will never come?
yeah, I'm still discovering that, I think. But I think for me, it's actually doing what you need to do in order to know your place in who you are. And so even when you can't get the full picture, you can still connect back. You can still connect into place, maybe not so much to people. But as we've talked about, place is really important too. And so I think those rituals give us opportunities to have the conversations that we know we're never going to have in person. And so sometimes that doesn't feel like enough. Sometimes it's more than enough to actually know I'm loved. I have a beautiful family I've created and taken, I have a wider community that I get to enjoy and love as well. And so I think it's about that still having hope. There might be contact, but if there isn't, I'm okay with that, because ultimately that's not my fault. That's not on me. That's on the trauma that others have gone through in this whole process. And so I think for me, I have great sympathy for my birth mother, because she obviously went through such a horrendous thing and is still dealing with the effects of it too. So she's just as much a victim in all of this as I am. And so for me, yeah, I think that's the answer, is when you don't get all the answers, it's okay. And it's okay to sit in that as well, but still be hopeful, I think, in the future.
And a no doesn't always stay a no. I've spoken to plenty of adoptees who got a hard no, and at some point it's changed. And I hope that happens for you. And I love that you're taking steps that if it remains a no, that you're finding other ways to connect with identity and to find your place, Ben.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's for me, that's the journey now, and that's okay. I'm willing to see where that goes, because it's far better than just sitting in the dust, as it were. I'd much rather be up and out and exploring and seeing what it means.
So what's next for you on this adoption journey?
Well, there's still some pieces of the puzzle that I need to work out. And so there's this curious thing where on my adoption records, it says that my father had two brothers, but there is no family trees that I can find that have two brothers in there as well. And so I'm in the sleuthing stage again, I suppose. It's the next thing. So my
We make the
grandfather,
best stalkers adopted people. We really do.
absolutely, absolutely. So basically in Victoria, because he's from Victoria, his father passed away 30 years ago uh, this year. And it's actually, his records hopefully will be released around April. And on death certificates, usually they'll have the siblings of, like, or the children of the person who's died. So I'm waiting till April to see.
Can you let me know how that
Yeah,
goes?
we'll do. Yeah, we'll do. We'll do. Because I don't know. Are there uncles out there? I don't know. I know I've got a brother and a sister on both sides. Both sisters, unfortunately, have passed away, but there's two brothers. So I'm just curious to see, are there other cousins? Is there a bigger family? Are there other connections that I can make that I can actually maybe investigate? Because it seems to me a lot of the time, close family sometimes really struggle with this. but maybe sometimes wider family are more interested in sharing the family story as well.
Yeah. And two of the people who meant the most in my adoption journey are like first cousins of my biological mother, who met me down in Sydney and gave me just all these artifacts from the family and photos, and was so generous with what they shared with me, and became such an important part of connecting me to my family. They were the people who actually connected me in a way that felt real for the first time ever and made me feel part of it. So I hope that bears some
Mm,
fruit for you.
yeah, thank you.
So Ben's story reminds us that adoption trauma doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides beneath achievement, conformity, faith, busyness, until something cracks it open. And when the answers don't come, the work becomes different, not finding people, but finding peace. Ben, thank you so much for adding your voice to our collective story.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And to everyone tuning in, every adoption story is different, even though there are plenty of common themes amongst us, and every story matters. If you're looking for support, resources, or simply a place to be heard, please know that Jigsaw Queensland is here for you. And if you've got a story that you'd like to tell, just go to the Jigsaw Queensland website, find the podcast tab, and just scroll down a little and you'll find a prospective guest form that you can fill in, just like Ben did. And if you'd like to support the podcast, just leave a review, share this episode, or get in touch, because we love to hear from our listeners, and we get lots of lovely messages from you. So thank you for listening. I'm Jo Sparrow, President of Jigsaw Queensland, host of Adopt Perspective. Bye for now.